Yo, what's up? It's Someone That's Someone, and welcome back to another story mix. Today, we got one on the tropane alkaloids. The tropane alkaloids consist of scopolamine, hyoscyamine, and atropine, but you may know the plants as Datura, Belladonna, Brugmansia, and more. These are often regarded as some of the strongest deliriums out there, so I figured we gather some stories up and see how they compare amongst each other. And these experiences are very vivid, almost like a nightmare. You'll see some similarities, but also some strong differences. But before that, I do want to know that a lot of these stories were taken from back in the day, some that aren't on the channel anymore, so the quality will vary. But besides that, let me know what you guys want to see next. If you like these types of videos, you already know, subscribe and hit the like button. But without further ado, let's dive right into it.
Hide the knives. I'm an experienced tripper. In fact, my first drug experience was peyote. I'm not a heavy user by any means, 2 to 3 times a year. I'm a fairly regular pot smoker, and though I don't drink a lot, I'm an avid lover of beer. Hallucinogens are my love though, and I don't consider them just recreational. For the most part, they are done camping with friends, up of Michigan. That is the place. Tripping is supposed to be a spiritual experience that can be fun, but mainly, I consider it a reboot of my system. That being said, Datura is now officially off the list of camping supplies. I did my homework, I read about the bad experiences, and thought to myself, I'll do this smart. One thing I noticed about the bad experiences was they usually involve people who regularly use drugs and lead unhealthy lifestyles. I don't. Also, people usually seem to be in an urban environment where police presence can be summoned. That was being avoided. I also made sure I had plenty of water. I was not going to smoke any pot or drink. The dose I was using was considerably lower than most of the bad story doses. I didn't officially have any sitters, but my friends were all with me. They were using mushrooms, not Datura. I've tripped with them all before and trusted their abilities to separate reality from mythology if things got too hairy. My mistake was having read a great deal of Robert E. Howard the week prior, Conan, Cole, Bronmock Marn, etc. After ingestion, I didn't get the drunk feeling as bad as most people seem to do. I was in fairly good shape. I did start getting the effects quickly. The dark woods provided a lot of shapes that outrightly became pigs. I surprised and probably scared my friends half to death when I suddenly took up the camp machete and went to a glorious battle with the attacking savages. Of this, I have little recollection. I had been lucid for quite some time, but near dusk, the battle began. This is what my friend described. You went from talking about pygmy tribes and the Yeti into, "They're here!" You jumped up from your log, grabbed the machete, ran through the fire, and into the tree line, hacking everything in sight. We were too scared to come to you. In fact, we were worried that you were going to start thinking we were orcs too, so we left. My friends literally fled into the woods to get away from me. I don't remember much until I came across a dead animal, which could have been a whale, or a unicorn, or a megatherium, for all I knew. I spent a lot of time fighting pinks, or danes, or whatever. I read a lot of fantasy books and played magic cards, so goblins, morgos, viashinos, skullbears, trolls, gnomes, and a whole other assorted menagerie of evil was out to get me. Somehow, I wandered into a swamp and lost my sword. My friends found me hours later. It wasn't hard. I left a trail of hacked brush and was screaming quite loudly. I have vivid memories of terrible things coming out of the dark for me. The scary thing was, for the several hours I was alone, I didn't drink anything. Luckily, I was only a half-mile from camp. I didn't recognize my 2 friends when they came for me. I thought the flashlights were witch balls. I fought with them a little before I realized they were real and had water. I'm sure that I had pissed myself and was real glad to get dry clothes on back at camp. I was in and out of lucid dreams the whole night. I basically ruined their buzz, but being true friends, they found me more amusing than asshole-horrific. I still get dogged about that weekend, but I've been forgiven. However, in addition to the 4-day hangover, I cannot shake the uneasy fear that I could have killed somebody or myself. I was literally delusional, running around with a dangerous weapon in the woods. I could have fell on it. I shudder every time I think of that weekend. Given a choice between doing Datura again or eating an entire sheet of acid, I would eat the sheet. Datura is not something to be fucked with, and I'm a healthy, sane person with hallucinogenic experience. My advice? You probably are not strong enough for it, and if you are, you better not have a violent bone in your body or you can flip out easily. Have sober sitters that will absolutely not permit you to be anywhere near dangerous places or objects. Or just don't do it, because the hangover sucks and it really isn't all that fun.
Still sick. Datura seeds are by far one of the most delirious and nonsensical things I've ever consumed. I've taken this plant's seeds a handful of times, but the last time I consumed it is when it totally fucked me. I was at home in my room with my friends Blackman D, Jack with 2 Ks, and Tony. Jack, with 1 K, had brought over some moonflower pods and told me that they will trip me out. At the time, I did not know that moonflowers and Datura were the exact same thing. I should have noticed by the way the seeds looked, but I didn't. I grabbed a pod which contains around 300 seeds and consumed them all quickly. I ate the pod's insides then too. I sat back and waited. 10 minutes later, something happened. Something I knew I felt before. Everything got way heavy. My mouth was a desert and I was definitely high. I said out loud, "Fuck, I know this feeling," and everyone looked at me. I stood up and staggered to my bed because I knew what was bound to happen. I couldn't stop the trip, but I instantly knew the best way to avoid the worst. My bed was all that mattered to me. I don't know if anyone said anything to me after I lied in bed, but I just fell into it and waited for lucidity to take over. I knew this was Datura. There was no doubt in my mind. Before I lost semi-consciousness, I recognized the seeds and mentally kicked myself in the ass. For the next 7 to 8 hours, I was lucid dreaming throughout the night. I tried to sleep the effects away. I thought it worked. I awoke the next day and still felt mind-fucked, but stable. I hung out with some friends and had a normal day. That is, until nightfall. I was outside with my friends Liz and Tony. I was a little stoned on some pot and we were just sitting down. I was feeling sick that day. Suddenly, I look up and we were in the mall. I looked around and my vision quickly snapped back to normal. I told my friends and they said I still must be tripping. I was. Every 10 seconds, I would look up and see a different place. I kept thinking we were where we weren't. I can't remember everything though, and places I saw are hard to remember. I only remembered the mall. I went inside and slept it off. 2 weeks later, I'm writing this. I've been sick ever since I consumed that wretched Datura. This strong sickness. I've never been so sick in my life. It's so bad that I'll be going to the hospital today. I believe Datura killed my immune system and then something got inside. My sickness is all head cold times 1,000, along with weak and wobbly legs at certain points of the day. I get the chills, but I naturally am cold, but more so since I've taken that God-forsaken plant. Sensory illusion destroyed. On October 31st, 2005, I had a witch's brew of 33 Liberty Cap mushrooms, locally picked, and 3 Belladonna cherries from a companion who I will call Issa for the sake of his paranoia. On the 1st of December 2005, with the new moon black in the sky, an especially good time for earth magic and divination, in thick, dense cloud hovering overhead, I undertook a journey into the recesses of the mind and tasted my own insanity. Near Castle Cambay, about 5 miles from where I live, there is an ancient burial chamber called Landhill Long Barrow. It was partially destroyed by gravediggers in 1906, and 2 of the 3 doorways were collapsed. The only remaining door has been shored up with horrible iron bars and badly placed bricks. The space available is about 10 foot by 5 foot and 4 feet depth. It is infested with spiders, absolutely massive ones, and there are signs of rats burrowing from in the burrow and using the small cave as an escape route. Issa and I decided we would use the small chamber as an isolation tank, a sensory prison cell, if you will. In the same way, long burrows and tombs have been used for millennia to contact the fathers and ancestors. So, I read up a bit on Mayan, Aztec, Celtic, American Indian, Pictish rituals regarding the dead and speaking with them and deciding on a brew to help me there. I took 3 Belladonna cherries from Issa's back garden. He then gave me 3 fly agaric caps from his collection. I selected 3 plump-looking Liberty caps to put in and 3 Brugmansia flowers I had dried some time ago. This was purely numerology more than anything. 3 flowers, 3 cherries, 3 caps, 3 shrooms equals 12 elements altogether, which again adds up to 3. The number 3 has been sacred to native cultures since they learned to count. I discovered that during initiation rituals among the Peruvian shamans, they add cemetery dust or earth from a grave. So we went to the burrow during the week and collected some brown dirt from the back of the chamber. I put the mushrooms in a pan of boiling water and let them ooze out and turn into ugly little slugs. Then I took it off the heat and as it cooled, added the Brugmansia and Belladonna. The mud came last and added a distinct blackness to the whole thing. I let this steam itself and stew away in a corner whilst I busied myself with preparations. I then sevied and poured the brews into 2 half-pint bottles. It looked like a dull-colored urine. I went to Issa's house and he was preparing his brew of 55 grams of dry powdered Peruvian torch San Pedro cactus. It was thick like a vile mucus and the lemon slightly curdled, so he was drinking a bitter acid jelly that he had to spoon drink rather than gulp. As we made the 5-mile trek in the pissing down rain, I started to drink the first bottle of my brew. It tasted somewhere between glorious and disgusting. The flowers and cherries gave it a warm nectar kind of fruitiness, and the mushroom and earth made it taste like old jock straps. I managed to sip it down as the Peruvian shamans say, poco el poco, I think, or little by little. Once we were within a mile of the burrow, I started to feel very weak. My arms were like dead weights. My legs were dragging on the floor. I could hardly even climb a 3-foot-high fence without fear of falling flat on my face. All around me was changing. It was as if I could see the spirits of the grass, mud, trees, clouds, all making horrendous faces. But in that state of mind, I just chuckled. When we finally reached the burrow, I was already in a complete state. Issa was fine, just waiting for the mescaline to kick in, whilst I was semi-hunched, soaking wet, freezing cold in the doorway. This was supposed to be a journey for me to face my fears, but at this point all I could think of was being warm and dry. I unpacked my bag, and we lit some candles and lay a few trinkets around. Some old flint of mine, a statue of an owl, a piece of rock I had painted in honor of the mother. Issa had a look in his eye that said, "What the fuck?" and I couldn't place what he was confused about. Then I realized it was me, with eyes as wide as they could possibly open and gawking around the room in a semi-state of insanity. I dragged myself into the back corner and slumped among the rocks. Issa sat at the entrance and meditated. That's when everything started to go a bit weird. I closed my eyes and just appeared at home. I was in my flat walking around, and then I saw my girlfriend, I think, bad memory, and said I love you to her. Then I awoke and Issa was laughing. I love you too, man. Are you alright? I just stared and smiled and then nervously laid down again. It's hard to explain, but the walls became Issa and Issa became a rock, and vice versa for the next half hour. I would go to say something and realize it was a stone, not his face, and then hear giggling behind me and see him sat there with a look of shock on his face. Everything was what it is not and could possibly be. I grabbed Issa's foot at one point, totally convinced that it was something of mine that I needed to hold on to. Every time we tried to talk or I tried to say something, the words came out all jumbled and slowed down. I could hear the words in my head but couldn't speak properly. All I could manage every now and then was the odd, not far now, where,
All this from one bottle. I hadn't even opened the other one yet. I was attempting to speak to Issa, but all I could even muster was the beginning of a sentence and not the end. Issa is a master shaman in the making, so seeing me, somewhat his apprentice, in a state of no control was quite strange. I would think I was talking to him and then look up for an answer, and he would just look at me. Then I would slowly realize I hadn't spoken out loud. As these bizarre symptoms continued to increase, I began flitting between the dream world and the real world. Most of the inner visions were quite strange but slightly tame. I was in an etheric version of an ITV game show, then I was in town, then at home, then on a mountain. I think with these plants, you can literally appear and reappear wherever and whenever you want. When I closed my eyes, I could see the cave and other people. Then when I opened them, little fragments of the dream image would stay imprinted on the reality. For the next hour or two, I found I could see substances, items, bottles, and all sorts of strange things, but when I went to touch them, my hand went straight through. Because I had no way of telling what was real or not, I became convinced that if I mastered Brugmansia, I could walk through walls and make objects appear before my eyes. All the time trying to explain this to Issa and him just staring in disbelief. I went for a piss several times, probably 6 or 7, and each time got distracted by the outside world. When I turned around to re-enter the burrow, it was gone, and I searched around in dismay. Then Issa would shout from inside the burrow, and it would suddenly appear behind me. Just as we were about to leave because it was so cold and wet, I started actually breaking through the barriers I wanted to remove. All over the burrow, paintings started to appear. The most beautiful and archaic cave paintings in a Neanderthal style. They were crude, but somehow in their childishness made all the more special. I tried to motion to Issa that the room was covered in detailed, ultra-psychedelic imagery. All over the walls and dark shadows, there were intricate layered patterns of what I can only describe as insect wings. The pictures moved and swayed with some ancient energy, and my mind became actually aware that I was not merely hallucinating. I was seeing the cave paintings before the burrow was destroyed. They depicted the most wonderful romantic scenes of the hunt, a shaman, witches, wizards, communities, villages, burrows, aliens, and spirits. Everything I ever sought from Brugmansia was shown to me in an instant. On that note, Issa collected all of our things together and we started the journey home. I didn't know at the time, but Issa was quite worried about me. To me, I felt perfectly fine, a little disoriented and confused, but well aware of what was going on. Turns out, I wasn't. Issa told me that I was stumbling behind him, muttering and being distracted by all sorts. One minute I would be behind him, then he'd turn around and I was off in some ditch, claiming I could see something. Then when we got into civilization, I totally lost it. To be honest, I have absolutely no memory of how I got home or what happened. I had disjointed flashbacks of me finding an imaginary pen and demanding that Issa wait for me whilst I tried to pick it up. Obviously, it was an illusion, and my hand just kept going through it. There are not words to express how frustrating it is to try and touch something that all your senses confirm is there, but when you reach out, your flesh just slides through. When we got back to Issa's, I was in a worse state than ever. I thought I was fine, but I was swaying. I couldn't stand, sit, kneel, or move without seeing something or getting confused. At one point before we left for my flat, I demanded to know where Issa had put my clean socks and trousers. Him and his girlfriend B just stared in shock. I started rummaging through Issa's clothes and started getting angry that either they were hiding my dry clothes or I was so messed up that I was wrong. Another memory blank and I was home, with my house full of drunk friends of my fiancé's. She was worried sick and came to see if I was okay. I managed to grip enough of my sanity to fake being fine and kept my mouth shut, knowing I would make an ass of myself if I were able to have everyone's attention. One of Vixen's friends asked me if my trip was good, and did I see anything. I just nodded and said, "Very good, yes." It turns out Issa fully thought I had lost the plot and I believe if I were able to listen to a recording of the evening on tape, it would blow my mind. So, a final note, as a warning to the drug culture wannabes of the world, do not fuck with these plants. Mushrooms have a built-in defense system that if you aren't ready, you just get your pretty colors and your giggles. Brugmansia and Belladonna do not play games. These plants will make you temporarily insane. As the Peruvian shamans say, the Brugmansia is the key to the underworld. You become one with the spirits, but join with their complete lack of ego control. With Brugmansia, there is no control, and I honestly believe if Issa hadn't been there, I would have ended up in a ditch chasing some random illusionary object. But for those of you who want a profound shamanic experience, then maybe solanaceous plants are for you. Mother Darkness is my ally now, and I have dedicated myself to her. The journey I undertook in that soaking wet freezing cold hole has changed me forever. I no longer want to have fun on a journey. I don't want pretty colors and intricate but boring hallucinations. Brugmansia single-handedly rips the door off its hinges and demands respect. I have the second brew still to drink, and maybe on a somewhat warmer evening I will go back to the barrow and see what else she has to offer. But please, 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 if you cannot handle substances that remove your self-control, do not mess with these plants. Even the ayahuasca shamans in Central America warn people against the Datura shaman and his total insanity. So be careful and demand a companion comes with you. Side note, oh, and by the way, I still have blurry vision and sword speech for the next 24 hours after the end of the visions.
Eating bugs while my friends convulsed. My first and last Datura experience started with me and two friends sitting around at a house deciding to rip off a Datura plant. After finding one and tearing off a few flowers off it, we sat at our mate's house and boiled it up for a half an hour and drank about 3 cups each. Now, I am a very experienced drug user, but what happened next, I was totally unprepared for. At first, the only feeling I felt was extreme muscle tiredness, and I was almost unable to stand. Neither could my friends. Bang! I'm at my friend's flat chatting to his flatmate. I say, I want to go home now. He says, you are home. I say, I want to go home where my mom lives. She says, I am your mom. Bang! I suddenly realize I am at home. It's almost midday. As my memory comes back, I remember smoking many invisible cigarettes, thinking my mom and my brother were my friends, and talking to invisible people, basically not knowing where, what, how, or why. I later found out I had been crawling on the floor where we originally drank the Datura, eating bugs, quote for quote, while my friend convulsed and foamed at the mouth. When his straight sister called the ambulance, I leapt off the balcony in pursuit of a friend who was actually on the other side of the house. Then my mom was called, by whom I still don't know, and she took me home where I spent hours rolling imaginary joints, snorting imaginary lines, talking to thin air about crap, and basically scaring the shit out of my family. One friend wound up in some bushes with no belt, pants around his knees, listening, quote for quote, to music. The other was in the hospital in a morphine-induced coma. He was released the next day. He had been on antidepressants, and that fucked him up. I can tell you it's a very disturbing experience to take on a drag of a cigarette and find out you don't actually have one, or to talk to your brother about himself thinking he's someone else, or having your friends come around to see how you are, having a long chat with them only to realize they aren't actually there. I do remember trying to smoke my belt, throwing my cat in the bathtub, thinking my mom was Spike Milligan. The list goes on. Where's your head at? Let me start by saying that you will notice that just about all people's experience with Datura are very common. Mine was no different. I live in Sydney, Australia, and am 20 years of age. I have tried a lot of different drugs and never had one that I didn't enjoy. This was soon to change. My first experience with this nasty drug was only 2 weeks ago from the time of me writing this report, and it goes a little like this. I live with my father in the inner city suburbs. I was at home on a Saturday with no money and no plans for the night. My father comes home from walking the dog with this trumpet-shaped white flower, saying that he'd think it could be Datura. I go online to find some pictures of this elusive drug, and in no time have confirmation that it is very well indeed Datura. Now for my part, I am very excited about this little discovery and quickly ask where my father had found this stuff, but naturally he does not want to tell me because of obvious reasons, and just said that I probably walk past it every day. Now I catch a train to work, so I quickly went for a voyage up to the station in search of a free high, and was not disappointed that halfway there in someone's front yard were 3 shrubs of this stuff, with the white flowers hanging over the fence just waiting to be plucked from their stationary position. I take only one off the shrub. Upon arriving home, I tell my father that I found this little treat, and his response was simply, "Don't take that stuff with me around," but overexcited and very much wanting to give it a shot, I measure a coffee mug of water into a pot and throw in the flower I picked and the one my father found right away and begin to boil it in the water. I only boiled it for 10-15 minutes using a potato masher to press down on the flour to extract all the goodness, and when the water was a nasty yellow pissy color, I decided that it should be suffice, being that my experience with mushrooms worked quite well with the same method, and strained all the juice out of the flowers and poured it into the coffee mug. 2 tea bags, 3 large teaspoons of sugar, and a little milk should help erase the taste. I knew it was going to be bad from the smell, but it still tasted like shit, and I dry wrenched several times whilst downing this potent cup of tea. I sit down on the couch with my father at the computer and watch a little telly waiting for the onset of this drug, thinking it would take an hour or so, but within a half hour I feel noticeably different and decide that now it was a good time to tell my father that I did take the drug and not to worry too much if I started acting strange or talking rubbish. The come-on was so much stronger than I thought it would be, and the first thing I feel is my eyelids weighing too much for me to be able to hold them open, and this uncontrollable urge to lay down and close my eyes for a bit. I normally get tired and yawny when I take harder drugs, so this is very normal to me. So I head for my room to lay down for a while till this stuff kicked in. The time I drank this stuff would have been around 7 p.m., and I came back downstairs for my little rest that felt like 20 minutes at about 11 p.m. If you had read other personal experiences on this stuff, you will see that everyone needed to use the bathroom quite often and had the worst case of cottonmouth in their lives. Mine was no different. So after the most enjoyable visit to the bathroom I ever had, I ventured back downstairs to replenish my thirst. My father was still awake and could tell by the way I had to hold on to things to move around that I was quite high, and I had to confirm to him that I was going smoothly. I drank about 3 cups of water simultaneously and went out front for a cigarette. I felt numb and heavy-headed and at the same time floating in the clouds and lightheaded, unlike any other high I had experienced, and after finishing the cigarette, I came back inside to have another drink of water. I had a bit of chit-chat with my father, and he was constantly saying, "What are you talking about?" And my only reply was, "I don't know." Now the first scary thing to happen was when I needed a drink and came into the kitchen for this very reason. Picked up an open bottle of canola vegetable oil and had a chug on it, 2 gulps before realizing it was cooking oil and running out the front with the last gulp still in my mouth and throwing up over the balcony. All in the presence of my father, who was obviously dumbfounded. After I had thrown up all the oil, I needed a drink to get the taste out of my mouth and came back to the kitchen and picked up the same bottle of cooking oil and proceeded to lift it to my mouth for another swig, but I realized by the look on my father's face as I was doing, I had made another blunder and luckily pulled out before making the same mistake twice in a matter of 5 minutes. It was now about midnight, and my father decided to leave me alone and go to bed. I was grateful for that. The next few hours are blurry and my memory is very poor, but I remember watching an adult movie on the DVD-ROM drive of my computer, and what I will tell you next is probably the reason for me trying this stuff again. I couldn't take my eyes off the porn and was very much enjoying it. I must have watched the same movie 5 or 6 times, and the harder I watched it, the more it seemed that it was a personal show at a strip club or something, with the girls in the movie constantly looking at the camera, smiling and waving for you to join in. I found myself looking behind me to see if there was anyone else in this strip club, and was naturally happy to find out that she was in fact doing this awesome show all for me. At times it was like we were communicating through the computer, and she would wave for me to join in, and I had to explain that I couldn't get inside the screen for some reason. None of this was at all strange to me, and I was having a really good time, as you would imagine. I think it was around 6 or 7 a.m. that I decided to venture upstairs to have a nap, and being that I was tired, I thought sleep would be easy, but boy was I wrong. Now this was the most unbelievable sleep I ever had, because the whole time I was unsure as to whether or not I was actually asleep. I would remember every detail of every dream and constantly waking up whilst finishing big sentences and wondering if my father could hear me talking in my sleep. One dream I had was a cartoon, and I can remember making up every sentence of every character and feeling great about the fact that I had so much control of my dreams. This is way too hard to try and describe what I went through that night in my sleep, so I will leave it at that. I woke up at around 2 p.m. Sunday and got out of bed feeling full of energy and still really scattery in the head. I had to tell my mates about this magical drug that grows in the old Greek lady's front yard. I rang up my mate Dave and told him that there was something I want to show him, and he picked up that I was coming over to share some drugs with him, but he didn't know what. I went back up the street and this time picked 7 flowers off the plant and went home and wrapped them in cling wrap, then proceeded to Dave's house at about 5 p.m. "What the fuck is that stuff?" was the first thing Dave said after seeing a ball of green and white wrapped in cling wrap. "Datura, bro. You gotta have a test ride of this stuff, man." And Dave was happy to oblige. So in the cooking pot with the 7 little sins and 2 coffee cups of water, I was excited as Dave to do this stuff again, and so the same story as the previous night, boiled for 15 minutes, strained, and drank with tea. Now my first experience with this stuff had a heavy come on with only 2 of the flowers, and I had just given my mate Dave 3.5 flowers worth for his first time, so naturally, within half an hour, he was heavy as hell and quickly on his way to that exact place. My come-on wasn't as bad because I had done it within 24 hours, and I was still high from the previous night, but Dave was struggling. I told him, just lay down, close your eyes, and write it out. Dave has also had plenty of experience with drugs of all nature, and he did exactly that. We took the tea around 4 p.m., and so the plan was to stay indoors and listen to music and basically chill, and we did exactly that. Now my second time was even more patchy than my first time, and all conception of time was straight out the window. For the first few hours, all I remember was stumbling around Dave's apartment, running into walls, and whatever I could find I would fall on, over, or into. For some reason, we both kept on dropping plates and cups, and I think by the end of the night we broke about 6 cups and 7 plates. Why we needed to pick up plates was beyond both our grasp. All of this was unfolding at around 3 a.m. Monday morning, and we both had to work in a matter of hours. But this was not going to happen, and we knew it. I kept on running into walls and cupboards and just remember walking straight into them, knowing it was going to happen, but unable to stop myself from doing so. At one point, I headbutted a cupboard so hard it nearly broke my nose, and I still have a kink in it, but there was no stopping me from doing it again. At some point in the early hours of the morning, I remember hearing a knock on the door, and it was another mate of Jake. Thing is, he had a group of people with him that I didn't know, and they all came inside and sat down in the living room and didn't say anything. Jake put his head between his legs and sat there in silence, and I thought that he was really drunk or something, so I left him be and continued to walk around the apartment in haze. After a while, I approached Jake and tried to make conversation with him, and when he finally looked up, I came to realize that it wasn't Jake at all, and I had never seen this guy before. He just stared at me and didn't say anything, and it kinda freaked me out a bit, but didn't really faze me at all. I was smoking imaginary cigarettes all night, and there was maybe 6 people in the apartment I didn't know, and Dave was not to be seen, but he was there the whole time as well. Every time I looked away, the strange people would disappear, and I would walk into another room, and there they were again. This was completely normal to me. The silent people began to take on the form of mental patients, I believe because my subconscious thought I was going insane. And I was constantly making conversation with them, and they would talk back, but no sound would come out, so I was trying to lip read. As the night wore on, the strange silent people would take on more horror-based figures, and it was turning into a complete nightmare, but I wasn't scared at all. So much more happened, and I saw some really freaky stuff, but I can go on and on about it, but it's pointless. When the heat finally subsided a bit, me and Dave started to communicate again. We were both dying for a smoke of marijuana, so we decided to call up a drug dealer at 4 a.m. Now, Dave works in market research, and when he rang up the dealer, he started to introduce himself like he was talking to a client. The dealer was not impressed, as you would imagine. So finally, I called a taxi to go home, and I got home just before sunrise, went straight to my room, and went to bed. And sure enough, I had company in the form of mental patients laying on the floor beside my bed. By this time, I had my head together enough to know that I was hallucinating, but the mental patients were still with me. So I started to play around with this buzz a little by trying my hardest to produce new figures, in the form of sexy women naturally, and it actually worked, but I couldn't keep them there, and the mental patients were with me all night. At one point I asked them if they were hanging around me because they fancied me, and sure enough they nodded. There were only 2 of them when I got back to my place. They were both female, and one of them was the exact same one I was talking to at Dave's place. One of them was just a pillow on the floor, so the head was big and square, and she constantly had a big smile on her face with an enormous mouth. The other one was the one from Dave's place, a clock that was smoking crack at the start of the night, and the rim of the clock was like braces for her face. Yeah, I know, some wild shit. So I lay in bed for hours making conversation with my new friends, thinking to myself the whole time, am I going insane? But the fact that they were not talking back kept me from believing so. I dreamt the same as the night before with lovely, colorful dreams and somehow managed to call work and tell them I won't be making it in. I have no memory of this, so naturally when I called them the second time my boss was already informed and asking why I had to tell him again. Now I will tell you about the experience of the side effects, which weren't that bad at all. I couldn't read for a good 4 days, and this is the reason I had 2 days off work. I kept on getting little flashes of the trip, and if I rubbed my hands together, I could tell it felt like I did when I was high. My pupils were dilated for 2 days after the trip, and people would notice and comment on this, which is not a good feeling at all, so I had to wear dark glasses everywhere. Datura and DPH, results of experiment. Date 8/19/2014. Gender male. Weight NA. Age NA. Etc. Datura combined with DPH. Report. Testing first phase. Objective: attempt to engage in romantic and or sexual contact with a secret Datura or shadow person for science. For this test, a female or similar entity would be preferred. Substances utilized: exactly 500 milligrams of diphenhydramine in the form of pink minuscule pills consisting of 25 milligrams each. Tea of 1½ leaves obtained from a mature Datura variety specimen steeped for approximately 35 minutes. Substances on standby: 4 milligrams physostigmine in 2 sterile syringes consisting of 2 milligrams each. One is to be used for emergency if needed, the other to be used as a backup and or as an additional supplementary dose, to be administered by intramuscular injection. 1 container of 80 caffeine tablets consisting of 200 milligrams each, 1 container of 60 cytocholine caplets consisting of 500 milligrams each, 1 container of 60 L-carnitine tablets consisting of 500 milligrams each, 1 container of 30 clonidine tablets consisting of 0.2 milligrams each. Further information: carried out in dark room, no light or electricity, doors and windows locked, anything sharp or dangerous removed. Assistant has handheld battery-powered illumination device and journal with 2 black ink fountain pens. Assistant was given strict instructions not to interfere unless absolutely necessary, to paraphrase my condition and or actions during my experiment into said journal, and to administer the antidote and or required medicines if an emergency should occur. Time and duration of trip. Ingestion, 11:30 p.m. Onset, 12 a.m. Rise, 12:45 a.m. Peak, 2:30 a.m. Fall, 5:35 a.m. Vasalgia, 6 a.m. to 1:53 p.m. Conclusory outcome, successful. Completion of objective, successful. Further notes, throughout this experiment report, the hallucinated entity will be referred to as SE, shadow entity. This experiment report will be in the first person unless otherwise specified in the report. This experiment report is not in direct chronological order. The individual statements should not be assumed to be in an explicitly sequential order. However, the report as a whole is in a relatively chronological order to an appropriate extent. This experiment report contains extremely explicit material. Preface. Rise. Ingestion of prepared tea and pills commenced. Experiencing slight but barely noticeable pseudo-hallucinations, e.g. morphing, flowing, distortions, etc. After 1 to 2 hours, I noticed the distortions gradually escalating in intensity. After another minimally relevant chronological period, non-permanent, substance-induced schizophrenia symptoms appear. Objects in central vision freely form and eventually morph into gestalt forms lacking borders, appearance deemed to be a cascading pattern of ergativity. It gradually advances to actual hallucinations, both auditory and optical. This was when I initiated attempts to cause a shadow entity to manifest. I successfully created the manifestation of an SE of quasi-feminine form. I will now move on to the experiment. Objective. Engage in romantic and or sexual contact with SE. At first, SE is not responsive to communication, including commands. After approximately 5 minutes, SE starts to respond to simple questions, and its ability to reply improves over time. It eventually is able to hold a basic conversation and accept basic commands. This inclination of behavior akin to higher cognitive functioning is particularly intriguing and warrants greater research at a future time. The subject has features typically appropriate for the average human female, somewhat long hair, average mammary size, visible genitals equivalent to a vagina, etc. The subject does not wear any clothing and seems a relatively opaque dark grayish color with a minuscule amount of transparency. Experiment. Willingness to follow commands. Command. Walk from the north side of the room towards the south side. Response. SE proceeds to travel from one side of the room to the opposing side. Command. Walk from the south side of the room towards the north side and end at NNW. Response. SE proceeds to travel from standing position on the south side to the north side while curving appropriately to arrive at the north-northwest orientation. I now proceed to unfasten my pants and undergarments. In colloquial terms, I whip my dick out. Command. Walk towards me until you are about 2 feet away and stand. Response. SE walks in my direction and stops approximately 1 foot in front of me with its front torso facing towards me. Command. Very satisfactory. Now, stay absolutely motionless, so I may test your corporeality. Response. SE does not give affirmation by speech or expression. It obeys command and remains stationary. I now kneel down on one knee, and with my index finger and middle finger, I attempt to manually penetrate its orifice, resembling with near perfection a vaginal opening. Sans voila. My fingers penetrate, and I am able to feel vaginal walls, the tactile sensation resembling wet skin. SE makes a vaguely sexual noise upon stimulation. I then remove my fingers and attempt to perform cunnilingus on the subject. There is no taste, and it does not seem to produce any lubricant juices, and no actual lubricants have been used, but still it feels as though it was lubricated. Upon entrance of my tongue, it makes a much more sexual sound than before, and proceeds to lay its hand upon my shoulder as if to encourage me to continue. I do not oblige. I then proceed to remove my tongue from its orifice and stand up. Next, I begin phase 2 of testing. Command. Now kneel on your knees and grasp my phallus. Response. SE complies It then proceeds to look up at me, as if it were attempting to act seductive or sultry. Command: very good. Next, proceed to move your hands up and down my penile shaft. Response: SE hesitates, and then complies. I can feel stimulation as if it were actually real. Strangely, however, at the same time, there appears to be little, if any, friction. Remember that I have not used any form of lubrication. Command: now proceed to perform fellatio. Response: SE complies. The sensation is practically otherworldly. Its oral cavity is somewhat lukewarm and wet, but again, no actual saliva or lube is left on my penis. I proceed to ejaculate. However, my seminal fluids appear to go through SE as if it suddenly became ethereal, but without any actual change relative to the rest of our bodies. I now start phase 3. Command: now move over onto the bed and lie down flat with your front torso pointed at the ceiling. Response: SE attempts to ambulate towards the bed sultrally and proceeds to lie down as requested. It then appears to fondle its bosom while allowing its free hand to rub up and down its leg. I proceed to go to bed and position myself over it. I attempt French kissing with SE. It succeeds in the same feeling of non-existent salivary lubrication like mentioned before. SE appears to be deriving some enjoyment from this experience. It sometimes becomes tough to remind me that it's not an actual human. At this point, I black out. For the rest of this experiment report, I will have to work by what my assistant had recorded. My assistant apparently seems like he would be very great authoring adult books, judging from the verbose and romantic descriptions. However, for your sake, I will attempt to water it down as much as possible. You're greatly welcome. I succeed in vaginal intercourse with SE. Coitus stayed strictly in the missionary position. According to my assistant, all that he saw was me violently dry humping the bed while grasping the pillows. After perceived ejaculation, and of course the semen went on to the bedding, my assistant informed me that I then rolled over, facing the ceiling, and proceeded to light the imagined cigarette. I then spent 35 minutes whispering sweet nothings, presumably into the ear of my shadowy lover. After this, I passed out. This concludes my attempts at reporting the results of my experiment, written under the pseudonym Isopropanol.